I'm surprised to see that there seems to be a general trend to value truth over method. For example, you hear people say, I knew it all along, right? So, whatever current positions there are out there on the topic of COVID or on the Iraq war or any controversial topic, after a certain time has passed, you often hear people say, well, I knew it back in the day already. I knew it all along that this and this would happen. And I knew it back in the day that this and this is the case. Like with the Iraq War, for example, um, people would say, well, I knew it would end up being a catastrophe. We shouldn't have done it. Or as with COVID, whatever position you want to defend there. And what surprises me here is that it feels like people have got the priorities wrong because what is more important is actually not truth, but method. It's exactly the opposite way around. What matters is not for you to be right about the issue, to be right about the COVID vaccine or the Iraq war or whatever, Palestine Israel conflict. Take any big issue that might be um, an issue which divides people and on which you can have different positions. What matters is not the truth primarily. What matters is how you get to your position in the first place. What matters is method, how you come to your view on the issue. And I think this is something we easily overlook, but I think it's obvious and it should be common sense. The reason method matters more than the actual position and the truth, the veracity of the issue, is that in most cases, whether you're really right about an issue or wrong about an issue, really is not the end of the world. It really is not the end of the world, hopefully, for you. So, in some cases, it is. I mean, if you make the wrong decision when you go out in the morning, and for example, you choose to use your car in bad weather conditions and you don't survive it, you don't make it home, then it was a problem for you to have been wrong, right? To have made the wrong choice based on a wrong assumption about what would happen. So in certain cases, but these are only very extreme cases, the truth is ex- actually existentially relevant for you. You have to be right, or otherwise you just won't make it. Or when you think, uh, when you're taking a walk in the wood and yeah, you assume, well, there's a noise, and you say, well, it's nothing, and it turns out to be a bear, then, well, it was a problem that you were wrong. But in most cases, being wrong is not an issue. However, being wrong about how you get to your view, being wrong about method, is much more consequentially problematic because the way we come to our conclusions, we come to our views, we come to our positions on issues actually determines how able we will be to get along with other people. And that's something that, whether you like it or not, is it's basically there all the time. It's always a factor. So the issue is not that we can't have meaningful disagreements with each other. We can. I mean, this is one of the basic teachings of the 20th century, in philosophy at least, that the traditional view, which was that you have premises, and coming from those premises, you come to conclusions. And if there is not a clear move from the premises to the conclusion, then your thinking is just wrong. But in other words, being presented the same set of facts and observations, all people would have to come to the same conclusions. Now, this has been pointed out to be wrong and a very wrong picture of how reasoning works in general. And one of the major, observations in the 20th century of philosophy has been that you can have the same set of facts presented to two different people, and both being perfectly reasonable can come to very different conclusions. This has been the suggestion that you can have something like incommensurable positions. You can have different positions on issues which are equally reasonable, which are equally plausible, equally solid empirically, but totally different. And the idea behind this is that the way we reason, the way we make sense of reality, is not as it was thought about for centuries in logic. We don't have clear statements that have only one meaning. For example, the traditional examples for logical statements are, for example, about Socrates being mortal, Socrates being a man, all men being mortal, and so on. The problem with these examples is that in reality, most statements that we use when we describe reality don't have a single meaning. Take the really big sentences that people utter, like, for example, God exists or God doesn't exist. The term God has so many different meanings that logic cannot really be applied to most of those contexts, because people just mean different things when they say the same thing, right? Or another issue, like, for example, we are all one, something that's become very popular with New Age, for example, thinking. The meanings that this can have to people are so different that you can basically have the totally opposite positions using the same sentence. And behind this is how mind works in general. Mind doesn't work with single, clear, objective meanings. This is not how it operates, but it operates with what Lakoff and Johnson have been calling frames. And frames are composed of relatively subjective distinctions that then basically make up a bigger picture of what you feel to be real. This is one of the major contributions of the 20th century, to basically see that there is no immediate way from observations and data and events and facts to interpretations. Interpretations are always mediated through the frame which you use to approach the facts. They are always mediated through a certain school of thought, if you want, or a paradigm, if you want. Without a paradigm, a school of thought, which gives you the repertoire of frames that you can use, that gives you the repertoire of those basic units of meaning that you can apply on reality to make sense of it. Every school of thought has those. For example, empiricism, its basic foundations, its basic such frames that it's using is, for example, for something to have an extension, for something to have a size, for something to be observable. All of those are already assumed frames that you can then use to interpret reality. Without those, you wouldn't be able to see anything. You wouldn't be able to interpret any data. Data would be meaningless to you. The same thing when you're coming from a specific religious tradition. You have such basic assumptions, basic frames through which you perceive all of reality. Even in music, when musicians say, I now understand a musical piece. What does it mean to understand in this context? Is that they have developed basic frames that they can use. For example, in music, there are as many styles as there are, as many foundational types of frames there are to approach music. So every style has its own basic frames that it uses. And these are the smallest units of meaning that you can apply, because there are many different ways in which you can approach even music. You can look at, for example, a sequence of notes and then analyze it in terms of harmony. You can analyze it in terms of, for example, certain styles insist that you have to emphasize one note and then de-emphasize the other note. This is something very, very specific. Then you have other styles where certain intervals, for example, are forbidden because they are laden with metaphysical assumptions about how certain intervals represents evil emotions that you don't want to trigger. All of that stuff is relevant. And once you have been socialized in a specific tradition, in a specific style of thinking, you can then as a musician say, I now understand this piece of music. And the meaning of that, I understand a piece of music, is I have found a set of frames that I can apply on the experience of music. And with music, it's very evident that the data is the same. The data that people are presented with is identical. Two listeners listening to the same piece of music are presented with the same tonal exposure. They're exposed to the same musical piece. There is no difference in the data, unless someone has hearing issues and can't really hear the piece, right? Then, of course, yeah. But in most ordinary cases, both people are presented to the exactly same data, and yet they have entirely different reactions to it. Why? Because they use different ways of approaching what they're hearing. And this is, I think, one of the worst cases, with worst examples. Fortunately, in most other cases, in reality, we are not so different in our reactions to what we're exposed to. But music is, I think, one of the worst examples in the sense that people can have absolutely opposite reactions to the same piece of music, to the same data that they're presented to. In most other cases, when it comes to political conflicts, when it comes to reasoning about social issues, whatever, we actually tend to agree more with each other than be so radically, having radically opposing views. But however, the big picture still remains. The big learning of the 20th century was that you can be exposed to the same data and come to very different conclusions and still be reasonable about it. But the part of being reasonable about it, that's the crucial part, because you can also be non-reasonable about your conclusions. Being non-reasonable simply would mean, and you can be non-reasonable in music as well, in music interpretation as well. A non-reasonable musical interpretation would be to insist that just because someone is playing something the way somebody else played it, and that other figure is an authority. For example, oh, they play it like Furtwängler, and just because they play like him, it must be great, it must be awesome, and I like it. So the moment you know they play it like Furtwängler, you know you like it. Or the moment you know that Furtwängler liked a specific interpretation, you all also kind of have made up your own position to know that, oh, I now like this piece and this interpretation as well. This is not a reasonable way of coming to your conclusions. What would be reasonable in this context is to, on the one hand, figure out what's your tradition that you most resonate with, and to look what kind of emotional range does it elicit in you, so what does it bring forth in you, and to make a comparison. So in other words, be willing to socialize yourself in a different musical style, a different way of interpreting things, listen and see what elicits in you as well. And then make a comparison and say, well, this is something I feel more drawn to for those and those reasons. This is why I come to the conclusion that this is the better interpretation for me. But be aware of the alternative. So being aware is not just knowing, oh, there's somebody else out there. Because the only thing that people usually seem to agree on is that everybody else is stupid, right? They have the only one right interpretation. And every other school, every other paradigm is just silly. You have this in music, in extreme forms. There are schools of thought which are absolutely hostile to each other. They look upon other schools of musical interpretations as being outright dilettantes, as knowing nothing about music. And this we're talking about people who have decades of experience in music here, that you claiming have no understanding of music whatsoever, or are brainwashed or stupid. And the same thing happens even in science. You have diverse schools of thought which are so hating each other that the only thing, again, they seem to agree on is that everybody else is stupid, and that you're the only one who has the actual connection to the source of truth. That's not a reasonable position. A reasonable position in those contexts would be, again, to have looked at the different perspective, to have embodied the different perspective, so that to see what it makes you see, or as Verwecke might put it, to see what it affords you, what it makes visible to you, and what it makes touchable for you, so what you can reach with the help of that perspective, and to then come to your conclusion. And in both cases, this would be the reasonable position. And why this matters, crucially, is that method, or being reasonable about your conclusions, method matters because it defines how we meet each other, how we socialize with each other. And this is more important in truth, in the sense that you might be right or wrong about an issue. If it connects to your personal life and has consequences on your personal life, then okay, good or bad, whatever. So you took the vaccine, for example, it had bad consequences, you're dead. Well, okay, bad decision, that was a problem, right? But this is not something that's going to be always with you there. The reality of the facts that are surrounding you will not always have a consequence on your personal life, but method will, because it will determine how able you will be to communicate with other people and how able you will be to form social units. And if we get method wrong, we become incapable of socializing. That's the crucial point. And this is more important to me than being right about reality. It is more important because it determines how you can interact with other people, how you can have meaningful exchanges, and how to avoid war. And war is it's one of the most foundational, if you want, boundary conditions for human existence, because it has been the big filter which determines which social units will make it through evolution and which won't. Unfortunately, it has been there with us basically since we exist. War has always been there. It has been an essential part of reality. And if you don't get the sense-making part right, if you don't get the method right, war is unavoidable. You just can't get around it. It will be very, very difficult, unless, of course, you create systems and institutions that have so many fail-safes that they would compensate for our inabilities in sense-making terms, or our inabilities to communicate with each other. This is why method is so important. Method would allow you to get together with somebody else who comes to very different conclusions from you and reasonably speak about why you think something, about you reasonably lay open your own frames and assumptions that you take when you're approaching an issue. It's not just an exchange about facts and observations and empirical data. That's just a small part of it. The much more interesting part, where you can actually do something as a human being, is by looking inside and seeing how your relevance realize, right? As Verwecki might put it. How you take certain frames and with those approach a certain reality. So for example, when you have a severe conflict like Palestine and Israel, what we could meaningfully do, while not being on the ground there, so we're significantly lacking in really important solid data, all of us don't have much data on those issues. What we, however, could meaningfully do is get together and see, well, what are the things that are relevant in this conflict for me? Is culture important for me, for example? Is culture a relevant factor for me when I come to conclusions here? Do I think that the culture on both sides is different? How do I think it's different? Do I think that socioeconomical issues are important? Do you think that history is important? Do you feel that perceived history, so that's the stories that people tell about each other, are relevant? And this is stuff that you can lay out into the open because it's already in you. It's something that you find in your own assumptions when you're approaching the conflict. And this would be something that is very much sharing about yourself more than about the reality on the ground, because again, most of us don't know much about the reality on the ground, and it is a difficult issue. It has many factors which are involved here. But you could be open about how you experience whatever you're given as a set of data. So it can be something that tells something about yourself in a meaningful way to a different human being, which on the other hand could be open to receive that and see that you are aware of issues being relevant, of issues touching you, being important to you, and you could be recognized by that other individual, even though you might still come to different conclusions about the issue. This might still be the case. It not even might not be the case. It most likely will be the case. Just for example, if you've grown up in different countries, and you know, for example, authoritarianism in a different way, first person, than somebody else who's been raised in a country where authoritarianism was not that much of an issue, this already will significantly taint the interpretive frame through which you will approach such a conflict, like for example, Israel versus Palestine. Or if you live in a country like I do, where, for example, the country is basically owned by the mafia, by a very small and a group of people who are very vocal and who have a lot of power in their hands, you will approach political interpretations differently than if you were raised in a country which is more democratic and where you have more distributed systems of power. You will think by default differently about those issues. And they are in you, they're literally embodied in you because you've felt this, you've experienced the consequences of that environment. And it shapes you, it shapes how you experience reality. And this is something that you can meaningfully share with other people and then tell them why you then come to certain conclusions when you think about political issues. Then it becomes an act of intimacy between people, even when they talk about just political issues, right? It can become something that meaningfully connects people, even people who have opposing views on those political issues, because they share something authentic about themselves, about how they experience reality, first-person reality, and how it matters to them. And this almost never seems to happen. The opposite seems to happen. We come with these already assumed frames to the picture, very much like the musicians with their assumed style of thought that they insist is the only style, musical style, that is proper and right and appropriate. We come to the picture, we're given a relatively small set of data and facts, interpret it, and insist that this is the only way you should interpret it, and if you don't, then you're irrational or even crazy. And crazy is the, I think, most often used term on social media as of lately, if I'm not mistaken. In every second sentence, somebody says, well, they're crazy, they've gone crazy. They've gone mad. And when people start doing that, it just tells you we've got the priorities wrong. The priority should be, first of all, to make sure that we can talk to each other, we can have meaningful exchanges, and we can feel we can disagree on an issue and still like being connected in the common sense of being one part of humanity. When that's not there, and we're over-focused on, but I'm right about the issue, it might make sense to ask yourself, well, is being right really more important than your ability to communicate with other people or being in a meaningful exchange? Would you think that you're so right that it trumps your ability to feel like you're part of a same social group as somebody else? Or you would see that the necessity, and sometimes this is the case, the necessity to actually see the other as an opponent, that in certain cases needs to be destroyed. And this is something that happens in war. In some cases, people, whether they like it or not, here the social trumps the factual. And the social creates facts, it creates reality, the reality of war, which is it's a very real thing, right? And for social entities, this is the primary filter, which I think is even more relevant than facts, because most facts that are out there are just not socially relevant. They don't have social implications. Even difficult topics like the Iraq war or the Palestine-Israel conflict today, those are things that have, they have a very severe reality to them. They're very real. Even those don't necessarily have immediately as facts social consequences for you, necessarily. You're not there, you're not in those conflicts immediately. But they will have immediate social consequences on you, depending on how you approach them, on your method of sense making and how you come up to your own conclusions about these issues. And to me, it's really puzzling how we don't see this, how we don't see that method has, in many contexts, primacy over truth, simply because it determines the conditions for our ability to even talk to each other. It determines the conditions to be even able to figure out truth in the first place, and it determines how social entities will develop and whether certain social entities will survive or be extinguished by others.